Gender Policy Director, Jen Klein.
Good morning, everyone. So good to see you all. I just want to start by thanking everyone for being here and for tuning into the live stream for those who are not actually physically in this room. As you heard, my name is Jennifer Klein, and I am the Assistant to the President and Director of the Gender Policy Council here at the White House, where I have the privilege of working with so many of you in this room and every day on a range of issues that affect women and girls and gender equity and equality on behalf of President Biden and Vice President Harris. As you all know, if you haven't heard it from him directly, I'm guessing you haven't actually been in, even listened to a speech that President Biden has made, because one of the things he will say over and over and over again is how he is one of the original authors. He is, in fact, the original author of the Violence Against Women Act, and really has been a champion for survivors before that and since then. So that law is celebrating its 30th anniversary in September, and that is in large part a testament to his leadership and, of course, to so many in this room and around this country. And today, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of the things that this administration is doing, some of which you will hear about today. So today we're here because I have the great fortune of kicking off this exciting event to mark the 1-year anniversary of the first ever U.S. national plan to end gender-based violence. Before we turn it over to our agency colleagues to share some exciting updates, I want to acknowledge the many leaders, both in this room with us and online, who brought this movement to where it is today. I can't name each of you who have played a critical role, but you have been leaders who have championed efforts to address gender-based violence for years. I'm going to say decades in some cases. Previous senior advisors on gender-based violence from across different administrations, agency leaders from across this administration, and advocates and survivors whose tireless and courageous leadership has changed the world and the way we do this work. We would not be here today celebrating the first ever national plan and a comprehensive whole-of-government approach to ending gender-based violence without each of you. And we could not be more grateful to mark this moment not only with you, but with continued action to address gender-based violence. Today, you will hear updates from agencies on new policies and actions they have recently taken to implement the national plan. We're also releasing the final report and blueprint of the White House Task Force to address online harassment and abuse, which, as you will hear more about shortly, summarizes historic actions that the administration has taken to address online harassment and abuse. And of course, even as we mark these achievements, we know that so much work remains to be done to respond to the needs of survivors, to serve communities that have been, particularly those that have been left behind, to increase accountability, and ultimately to prevent gender-based violence from happening in the first place. So as the administration continues to implement the national plan, we pledge first and foremost to keep survivors at the heart of everything we do, as we have since the very beginning. And we look forward to continuing to partner with leaders in this room and all across the country. Thanks so much for being here today. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my fearless colleague, Senior Advisor for Gender-Based Violence, Catherine Powell.
Speaking of fearless, it is such a joy to see Jen Klein in action each and every day. Thank you, Jen, and thanks to all of you in marking this 1-year anniversary of the first ever U.S. national plan to end gender-based violence. We're celebrating the work and accomplishments of so many of you in this room. The national plan involves not only a whole-of-government approach, but a whole-of-society approach, and the importance of partnerships with those of you outside government, service providers, advocates, and survivors. including those of you addressing the experiences of so many at various intersections. Just yesterday, a colleague and I met with a survivor here in the People's House. Our door is always open because the experience of survivors grounds and centers our work. And as you'll soon hear from agency leaders, this administration is committed to preventing and addressing all forms of gender-based violence, whether in the home, at school, at work, in our communities, on and offline. I also want to emphasize that today's announcements are only part of the administration's broader, long-standing commitment to not only prevent and address, but to end gender-based violence. With that, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Robert Shriver, the Acting Director of the Office of Personnel Management. Over to you, Rob.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Catherine, thanks to Jen, my administration colleagues, and all of the advocates here and on the live stream. I'm OPM's Acting Director, Rob Shriver, and it's really just such an honor to be here with such a strong group of leaders from inside and outside of government. You don't need me to tell you that gender-based violence impacts 2 in 5 women and 1/4 of all men in their lifetimes. The Biden-Harris administration understands the critical role that an employer can play protecting victims from harm. That's why the National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence includes a focus on workplace policies. And we are committed to policies that protect our teammates from harm, help survivors rebuild, and even save lives. OPM is really proud to contribute to this work. We're the agency that's focused first and foremost on our civil service, 2.3 million strong, the largest employer in the country. And as the HR agency for the federal government, we know that the policy changes that we pursue, they really add up. They add up not only for the 2.3 million federal employees and their family members, but if we can be a model employer in the government, we can help drive change across all employers, and that's what we strive to do. Now, there are a lot of different leave policies that apply to federal employees: sick leave, personal leave, parental leave, family and medical leave, leave banks, leave donation, leave without pay, and more. It can be complicated, and there's still gaps there that we need to fill. And for someone who's facing gender-based violence, time off is more than a break from work, right? It might be the critical time that that person needs to address what could be a dire situation. And folks have endured so much already. We want to make it as easy as we can for employees to know the options that are available to them. And as I mentioned, there's all of those different leave programs, and it's really hard to navigate and apply them to your specific circumstances. So what OPM is doing today is we're issuing guidance consistent with the Presidential Memorandum on Supporting Access to Leave for Federal Employees and to advance the National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. Our guidance directs agencies to expand leave access and options for federal employees who are impacted by gender-based violence. And there's a broad definition. This includes domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and more. It applies regardless of the offensive behavior taking place in person, online, or through an app. And it applies if the conduct occurred in the past but continues to affect the employee. Just like so many of our policies that have needed to be updated in the wake of the pandemic, these policies recognize that the workplace at times can be the home, and gender-based violence can take place in the home, and so it provides information on the leave options that are available to people in those circumstances as well. We also have a fact sheet that we're releasing along with our guidance, and this is meant to both help agencies and agency HR understand the way that these leave policies apply, and the workforce itself. We need to both be educating the workforce and HR. So that's what we're doing through the guidance and our fact sheet. There are so many situations where these policies will make a critical difference. For example, someone may be seeking medical treatment, including mental health services like counseling or therapy. They may be receiving services from a support organization or a group. They may be making plans for their own safety or obtaining a protective order or participating in child custody proceedings. These are just examples of all of the types of activities that we know victims are facing and they need to address, and they need to have paid time off in order to do it. Federal employees live their values through their service every single day, and it's only fitting that those values guide our workplace policies too. So today it's an honor to be part of this critical work and to share the stage with the leaders in the Biden-Harris administration and to try to live up to the example that the president himself has set. Thank you so much, and I'll pass the floor back to Catherine.
Thank you, Rob, for helping the federal government lead by example. Next, we're going to hear from the chair of the EEOC, Charlotte Burrows.
Good morning. What a pleasure to join all of you for this important anniversary. I am so humbled to be in such amazing company. And I wanted to say first thank you to the President for his leadership on this issue, and also to, of course, Director Klein, to Catherine Powell, for your wonderful work, and the entire team at GPC. Everyone deserves safety, dignity, and respect in the workplace. Unfortunately, and our experience at EEOC has found that too often in our investigations, that's not the reality for so many, because workplace harassment in all its forms really remains widespread. And for the last 5 fiscal years, over 1/3 of all of the charges that come to the EEOC are received that are including some form of a harassment claim. In FY 2023, those charges alleging harassment increased, unfortunately, to over 30,000 in that 1 year. And sexual harassment charges in particular, gender-based harassment in particular, also increased. We see that harassment occurs in every industry, every occupation, from farms to restaurants, the factory floor to the retail store, and hotel rooms to boardrooms. Harassment has significant economic consequences: fewer hours, lost pay, demotions, damage to reputation. Sometimes women are forced to leave a job or profession, all affecting current and future earnings. And the lack of economic security or a precarious working situation can really make it harder for someone to exercise their rights, and they risk retaliation, their job, and their safety. So it is very significant, and I am very grateful that this administration's first ever national plan to end gender-based violence adopts a whole-of-government approach to ensuring that the economic security of survivors, including preventing and addressing gender-based violence at work, and informing workers about their rights. So for nearly 6 decades, our agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has been dedicated to eliminating discrimination, including harassment and retaliation, as a barrier to employment and widening the path to economic opportunity for all. And as the national plan acknowledges, addressing systemic harassment in workplaces has long been a strategic enforcement priority for this agency, and issuing updated guidance has long been a personal and agency-wide goal for us as well. Today, I am very pleased to announce that the EEOC recently released our updated enforcement guidance, which is truly a comprehensive, critical resource for preventing and addressing workplace harassment. And so many of you provided comments and insights and support along the way as we created it. That guidance will, I believe, truly help prevent harassment, advance equal opportunity, and enhance safety for employees on the job. It really provides workers with important information about the right to work free from harassment and informs employers exactly what they're supposed to do, their responsibilities under the law. The guidance has more than 70 examples that discuss harassment on all bases covered by the laws that EEOC enforces, including several examples of gender-based violence. And the guidance discusses legal standards and addresses really emerging and cutting-edge issues, including harassment involving virtual work environments. But it's not enough to wait for workers to file some charges. While we continue to have really robust enforcement, we are committed to that, we can't sue our way out of this problem. And I know you know that. That's why the guidance also focuses on prevention, to help employers create respectful and fair workplaces where no one will be subjected to unlawful harassment based on a protected characteristic. One of the agency's other strategic enforcement priorities, consistent with the national plan, is to protect vulnerable workers and persons from underserved communities. Our guidance reflects this commitment by providing examples that illustrate harassment of older workers, immigrant workers, and persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, among others. And in January, we launched our new REACH initiative, which ensures that the EEOC's outreach and education efforts are reaching workers who often are the very least likely to find us on their own, despite their great need. We want to ensure that workers have access to our resources and know their rights, including the most vulnerable workers and those who live in parts of the country that are geographically removed from an EEOC office. So we've been holding in-person and virtual listening sessions led by my colleague, Commissioner Kotegal, with a broad range of stakeholders across the country, including a session last week on gender-based violence at work. As we approach the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we must remain committed to equal opportunity for all. The EEOC's new guidance is a critical tool for ensuring that the doors of opportunity will open continuously wider so that the landmark law continues to protect all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Burrows. We next hear from FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel.
Good morning. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Jen, and everyone here at the White House Gender Policy Council for inviting me to join you. More importantly, thank you for developing the first ever national plan to end gender-based violence, and congratulations on a year of progress. Now, at first blush, it may not be clear what the Federal Communications Commission is doing at an event about gender, but we're going to start with this. I'm the first woman in our nation's history to be confirmed to run the FCC. It took too long, so we don't have time to spare. And when I think about digital technologies, I see how they're woven into everything we do in life. And it really becomes clear that thinking about digital technologies is part of how we are going to solve this challenge. So let me explain how the FCC comes into this. Before announcing the national plan back in 2022, the President signed a law called the Safe Connections Act. Now, this law gave my agency new tools to address communications for survivors of domestic violence. And we've embraced this responsibility, and rightfully so, especially when you consider that 1 in 4 women in this country are survivors of domestic violence. Now, for anyone affected by domestic violence, a phone is a lifesaver. It makes it possible to reach out for help, and it's a gateway to building a new life away from harm. So the Commission took these new tools in the Safe Connections Act and we put them to use. We started with family plans. Now, most of us sign up for family plans because it is less costly and it's convenient. But for survivors, these can be a source of control. These plans allow an abusive partner to monitor calls and location. So we adopted rules to require carriers to swiftly and securely separate the phone lines of survivors from family plans. And along those same lines, we adopted rules to make sure that survivors can call domestic violence hotlines because we're removing those numbers from call and text logs. That means they can reach out without fear of discovery from their abusers. And because survivors often struggle financially when they start building new lives away from harm, we set up a way for them to get discounted phone service. And so all of this is real progress. But there's a new challenge that survivors are facing when it comes to connectivity. Because it's not just our phones that can track where we go and what we do. The newest generation of cars is like smartphones on wheels. They come with built-in connections that can help you locate your car in a vast parking lot or call for emergency help when you get into a crash. But in the wrong hands, these connections and this data can be used to do real harm. Late last year, the New York Times ran a story about the ways connected cars are being weaponized by abusers to stalk and harass survivors. A huge problem is that much like family plans for phones, the survivor's use of the car is tethered to their abuser. The survivor calls the car company looking for relief only to be told there's nothing that can be done. Now, I don't think that answer is good enough because like a smartphone, access to a car is a lifeline for survivors. It's a means of independence, and it's often essential for anyone who's seeking employment and support. That's why last month, the FCC started a rulemaking to explore ways to empower survivors to separate the connections in their cars, just like they can separate phone lines on family plans. To do this, we're taking our cues from the communications law and also this new law known as the Safe Connections Act. The bottom line is that no survivor of domestic violence and abuse should have to choose between giving up their vehicle and allowing themselves to be stalked and harassed by those who access their connections and sensitive data about where they go and what they do. Instead, we can make sure these new forms of communications can help keep survivors safe. And working with people like those who are in this room, I'm convinced we're going to be able to do just that. So thank you again to the White House Gender Policy Council for your leadership and your partnership. I look forward to our continued collaboration, and I really appreciate you having me here today.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. We will next hear from the very first Senior Advisor for Gender-Based Violence here at the White House, Lynn Rosenthal, who is currently the HHS Director of Sexual and Gender-Based Violence. Over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, you're not really supposed to start remarks at a podium in the White House by, okay, wow. It's not really. But when I walked in this room, that's what came to my mind. Because if you're like me, we're charging from thing to thing in our personal life and our work life, and we just go on to the next, and we don't always stop and pause to take in the significance. So when I walked in here this morning, I thought, okay, wow. So I'm honored to represent the Department of Health and Human Services work to implement the National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. I want to, as always, thank President Biden for his unparalleled commitment to this issue and to the Gender Policy Council for bringing us all together. Jen Klein has led this miraculous effort along with Rosie for years, and then Catherine came to us, and Catherine's calm approach to moving us forward together has been stunning. So thank you, Catherine, for that. HHS fully embraces the public health approach to ending gender-based violence that is represented in the national plan. As Health and Human Services leaders, we know that we have a unique responsibility to address the health and behavioral effects of gender-based violence and to prevent it from happening in the first place. And I passionately believe that if we can get this right here, we can prevent so many other challenges in health and behavioral health. So we at HHS took the whole of government approach to heart, and we implemented a whole of HHS effort. So on this first anniversary, I want to commend the HHS agencies and departments who've been so key in leading the implementation of this plan, and this includes CDC, NIH, HRSA, Office of Trafficking in Persons, ACF, SAMHSA, ACL, and many others. There is a quiz in just a minute. These agencies, but it's stunning, these agencies have been leading in the prevention, survivor well-being, and research pillars. Their achievements include building state-level infrastructure to prevent sexual violence, bringing public health departments, advocates, and providers together, improving the capacity of healthcare providers to address gender-based violence in HRSA's public health clinics, integrating survivor health and well-being into health and behavioral health programming, and expanding research, data, and evaluation efforts. A consistent theme across our deliverables is our commitment to health equity and to centering survivors and communities that have previously been marginalized. And everything I know about this, I learned from the people in this room, To that end, I want to share recent actions that we took to implement the national plan. On April 15th, the Administration for Community Living released a notice of funding opportunity to support new and existing elder shelter models. This notice of funding opportunity announces plans to award 2-year cooperative grants to support shelters in addressing the emergental and transitional housing needs and other wraparound services for older adults, including those with disabilities, those experiencing abuse, neglect, or exploitation all across the country. These are exciting models. So thank you, ACL. We are also alarmed, as we heard, by the high rates of sexual violence committed against people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Women with IDDD face at least twice the rates of sexual violence as do non-disabled women, and men with cognitive and intellectual disabilities are also greatly affected. People with IDD also face greater barriers to safety and to justice. Bringing federal partners together to understand this issue and identify the solutions has been important and inspiring. I say that for those of us working on it, it's been a labor of love. We have worked with survivors with IDD to follow their lead in identifying solutions. So for Sexual Assault Awareness Month on April 30th, ACL, OASH, and ACF released a Dear Colleague with guidance to rape crisis centers, domestic violence programs serving people with disabilities, and a wide range of other federal grantees to better serve victim survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are continuing those efforts through a webinar training series that includes a training event for state developmental disabilities and mental health administrators and related federal agencies. Our aim is to improve the capacity to bring survivors justice and safety, but also with a focus on prevention. Prevention is possible. Prevention is possible. And finally, I want to highlight the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services and Shondell Dawson's great leadership. She's here with us today. In the fall, OFIPS announced $7.5 million in FIPSA funding to support 35 cooperative agreements in the culturally specific domestic violence and sexual assault program. These new grantees provide trauma-informed, developmentally sensitive, culturally specific services for children, adults, and youth affected by domestic violence and sexual assault. I had the privilege last year of attending a powerful convening of these grantees, many who were receiving federal funding for the first time, but who had been on the front lines for a very long time. The innovative services that they provide show us what can be done when programs are designed to meet community needs. So we look forward to continuing our work with all of you to respond to, but importantly, to prevent gender-based violence. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act and the 40th anniversary of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. So when I was reflecting on these milestones, when I was coming here and reflecting on these milestones, I remember what President Biden has always said, as Senator Biden, as Vice President Biden, as President Biden, what lovely words. He has said, this legislation, and speaking of VAWA, he has said this legislation will continue to evolve as we learn more about how survivors, how families, how communities experience these various forms of violence. I believe that this groundbreaking national plan will also follow a similar journey. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And our last report out for this part of the program is from my immediate predecessor as the White House advisor on gender-based violence, Rosie Hidalgo, who is currently the Justice Department's Director for the Office of Violence Against Women. Rosie.
Thank you so much. And Lynn, I'm going to also imitate your, oh, wow. It is phenomenal to be here today and to see the impact of the collective action over decades, but also the collective action in shaping our first ever U.S. national plan to end gender-based violence, and be here to mark the continued progress. And I want to thank Jen Klein for her tremendous leadership and vision, Catherine for the amazing work that you're doing, moving us all forward, Carrie Bettinger-Lopez, who also was a White House advisor on violence against women, is with us here today too. There you are. And all of us, as we have continued together to move and mark our nation's commitment to preventing and addressing gender-based violence. And as you all know, OVW is tasked with implementing the Violence Against Women Act. And as we've all noted, just such tremendous, significant bipartisan legislation that framed our nation's commitment, and with the leadership of then Senator Biden, but also really also reflecting tremendous grassroots advocacy, the voices and leadership of survivors, and that collective action that it took to pass the very first VAWA. And then to your point, Lynn, each VAWA reauthorization, it has in fact evolved and continued to say, what are we doing well that we can scale up? Where there's still gaps and barriers? How do we grow our collective efforts to address what are really significant, comprehensive solutions that are necessary? So as we're marking now VAWA 30th and just taking that time to reflect, I think we can all acknowledge that a lot of progress has been made, but the U.S. national plan also reflects that we have a lot further to go. And that's what's exciting about the plan, is that it says, how do we pull together in one place a blueprint, a framework that really, again, reflected all the stakeholder input. It has these key guiding principles that are such a North Star that really reflects the voices and leadership of survivors and advocates, the voices of those from historically marginalized and underserved communities, and a vision of hope, but hope rooted in action. So I love the second part of it, which is actually strategies for action. So we all continue to come together. And as we're reflecting on VAWA 30th, we sort of see that one of the hallmarks of VAWA is fostering a coordinated community response. So many of our grants do that. Our grants call in people and say, we need everyone at the local level. It's not just law enforcement or victim advocates or courts, it's everyone, plus community-based organizations and faith-based and educational institutions. And our grants try to foster that. And we see that where it's working well, and as the OVW director, as I've been able to travel around the country, it's remarkable when it's working well and the huge impact. But the national plan, what's so exciting, is it helps us say, what's our federal coordinated community response? It takes all of us. It's not just Department of Justice, as we've heard today. It's HHS and EEOC and OPM and the FCC and many other agencies. There were more than 15 agencies that helped launch it, many others. And it's like, what is our federal coordinated community response? To all of us see the role that we can play. And so that gives great hope for how we continue with our strategies for action.
And I've been able to see over this year, and thanks to the GPC that has convened us quarterly with a federal interagency working group, looking at the different pillars, seeing how we can strengthen collaboration. Even with OPM for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we held a convening across many federal agencies called Feds at the Forefront. How do we pause during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and lift up promising practices, learn from one another? We're launching a whole communities of practice to go further, because it's like that saying, you can go fast alone, you can go farther together. So this plan has helped us strengthen that collaboration. Even within DOJ, we came together, OVW with Access to Justice and the EOUSAs, to put out new information on a provision of VAWA that now is a federal civil cause of action on the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So I know we're going to talk about that later today, but that was an exciting provision in VAWA, and across DOJ, we're collaborating to be able to launch that. And we'll send folks the link to that new reference brochure that's now, we have over 3,000 versions of it that we're now sending across the country to all EOUSA's office so they can help get the word out in their communities. And so as we're continuing to strengthen that collaboration interagency, I also want to just quickly highlight a few key things at OVW, because VAWA's reauthorization in 2022 also reflected tremendous grassroots advocacy, collective action to expand and add new provisions in VAWA that very much are reflected in these goals of the national plan itself. And thanks to all of you and to the Biden-Harris administration, VAWA funding has increased 35% under this administration to $713 million. Yeah. And the president came in and put a bold vision. He said in his first budget, remember that, Lynn, as we all were looking at it, it's like $1 billion. We're all like, for VAWA. Before it was like nickel and diming it. It's like, that's right, we need a vision for how we scale up, because we're seeing really good promising practices. We need to scale that up. But again, even the VAWA money won't be enough. It takes all of us in all sectors, and not just whole of government, but whole of society. But real quickly, 3 examples. We just launched now in 24, a few weeks ago, a new grant program for law enforcement. And it's called the Demonstration Program on Improving the Law Enforcement Response to Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking. And it's known as the Abby Honnold Program. So we honor Abby Honnold, a survivor of a horrific rape on a college campus in Minnesota, who, through her own experience, sadly, experienced re-traumatization trying to navigate the criminal justice system. But like so much of this work where we've made advancements is survivors coming together to say, this is what I experienced, we can and need to do better. So the Abby Honnold program is in VAWA 22. We have rolled out new grants, solicitations for law enforcement to really center survivor-centered, trauma-informed approaches, centering also implementing our DOJ guidance on improving the law enforcement response by identifying and preventing gender bias in policing, 8 key principles that in the training with law enforcement, building out curriculums, and we're funding national TA to evaluate it so that then we can share out the tools, the assessments, the curriculum. So we're all committed to making sure that any survivor seeking law enforcement response or the criminal justice system, criminal justice or civil justice system gets the respect, the support, the holistic response that they need that's survivor-centered and trauma-informed. But we also heard that survivors want a range of options. And we do. We need multiple options, multiple pathways to safety, to justice, to healing, to well-being. And so one of the innovative things in this VAWA 22 was, for the first time ever, and it's a historic, Restorative Practices Pilot Program. So I'm here to say to you that just 3 days ago, we have launched for the first time ever a solicitation, $23 million to fund restorative practice pilot programs across the country. And we have also announced 3 new national training and TA providers, and we've put out for the first time a solicitation of $8 million that will help evaluate and work with each of these sites carefully to make sure it's victim-centered, trauma-informed, and multiple pathways to healing. So it's not either or, it's both and. And finally, the third thing I want to mention is our tremendous commitment, along with all of you, to advancing tribal sovereignty, to taking leadership, hearing from the leadership in Indian country of Alaska Native communities and American Indians. We participated in the Not Invisible Act Commission, led by our amazing DOI Secretary Deb Haaland, heard a lot from survivors and survivor families of the issues of missing or murdered Indigenous people, and where there are intersections with domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, stalking. one of the recommendations of the NIAC Commission was to fund healing and response teams based on a tribal care model that would work more holistically with communities. So I'm here today to announce that we just, also a couple days ago, for the first time using some innovation fund money that we had from VAWA, have put out a solicitation of fund healing and response teams in Indian country. And so that's an exciting opportunity where we're going to have, again, a national support, but be able to fund tribal government, tribal coalition, urban Indian organizations together to develop that model, evaluate it, and share it out. So again, a lot of this, there's a lot more, and today we are putting up on OVW's website, I think, a 9-page fact sheet that our team has worked so hard on, highlighting many other new things over this past year since the national plan. None of this would happen without all of you, without centering the leadership of survivors, and without our vision together, collectively, those here, those online, and those everywhere. And again, even the global context, as we join our national plan with global national plans to continue learning from one another with a vision for hope and for action. So thank you.
Thanks to each of you for your leadership in addressing gender-based violence. As our speakers have demonstrated, implementation of the national plan has occurred across all the pillars in the plan, and that includes online safety. As Jen previewed today, we released the final report and blueprint of the White House Task Force on Online Harassment and Abuse. I now turn to my colleague Kaylin Crockett, my colleague in the Gender Policy Council, to discuss the work of the task force and today's final report. I invite Kaylin and our guest Marian Franks up to the stage. Over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Catherine. As Catherine noted, today we are delighted to announce the publication of the final report and blueprint of the White House Task Force to address online harassment and abuse. The President promised that he would launch this task force on the campaign trail, and releasing the report today is fulfilling that promise. The President recognized that as technologies advance and evolve, so too must our approach to addressing gender-based violence. And so to tackle this scourge, in June 2022, President Biden issued a presidential memorandum to establish the task force to address online harassment and abuse, charging federal departments and agencies to take bold new actions to enhance prevention, support survivors, promote accountability, and enhance research and data collection on technology-facilitated gender-based violence. While I hope everyone here has the chance to read the report in full, I want to share a few highlights. Today's report and blueprint outlines more than 100 actions across a dozen federal departments and agencies, including enhanced protections for students, new programs to equip children and youth-serving community-based organizations to promote online safety and prevent and address online harassment and abuse, and new funding for specialized services for survivors of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and in particular, the first 24/7 national helpline for image-based abuse, which I'm excited to talk about in just a few minutes. Altogether, these efforts represent an unprecedented investment from any administration dedicated to addressing this specific form of gender-based violence. And of course, none of this progress would have been possible without the trust, time, and generosity of the hundreds of stakeholders who met with the task force during the course of its work. We are especially grateful for the testimonies of survivors, whose stories always reminded us of the urgency of comprehensively tackling this often invisible form of gender-based violence. I also want to thank the many colleagues across federal agencies who are with us in the room today and online for their vision and contributions to the blueprint. And I want to especially thank GPC Director Jennifer Klein for her stalwart belief in this work, and to Rosie Dalgo, who steered the work of the task force prior to her role at the Justice Department, where she continues, as we heard, to be a champion for all forms of gender-based violence. And so with that, I am delighted to move to a discussion with Dr. Marianne Franks, President and Legislative and Tech Policy Director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and a professor on tech and privacy issues at George Washington University Law School. So Marianne, the release of the blueprint today is certainly a milestone for the administration's work to address online harassment and abuse, but we know that this issue isn't actually new, and it's one that you and others have been advocating to address for many years. And while we're extremely proud of the actions outlined in the blueprint, we know it's not enough to fully tackle this problem. Others have referred to the national plan as whole of government, but also whole of society, and that rings true for the vision of this blueprint. Can you tell us a bit about the progress that you've seen in the fight to end technology-facilitated gender-based violence over the course of your career in the past several years? And since the early days of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, what is most urgent to do now at this point? And throwing in there, how has the rapid advancement of generative artificial intelligence, the rise of deepfake, non-consensual intimate images, and child sexual abuse material also impacted this work and underscored its urgency?
I see that we're starting off easy, so thank you so much, Kaylin, for the introduction and for allowing me to have this opportunity to say a little bit about what we've seen transformed in the last decade or so. And if you had told me back in 2012, when I was first writing about some of these issues relating to online abuse as a law professor, then at the University of Miami, that sometime in the future, not too distant future, we'd be having a conversation at the White House about these priorities, I don't think I would have believed it. And I want to say back then, in 2012, I had just published, or had recently published, my first law review article, and it was about my concerns that at the moment, and it's maybe harder to think about this, to put ourselves back in this mindset, but there was so much enthusiasm about the internet that it was going to be, that it was in fact going to democratize everything, was democratizing everything, everybody was going to have free speech, there were going to be no problems. And my concern, because I've always been a pessimist, was that maybe that wasn't what was going to happen. Maybe the internet was actually making things worse. And to the extent that we had already seen that the law didn't do a good job of dealing with gender-based violence, how was the internet making it worse? And so the piece was titled Unwilling Avatars, and I was talking specifically about things that happened to women's bodies online and the kinds of ways that they were being exploited, stalked, harassed, surveilled. And in 2012, I got an email from someone I didn't know, and her name was Holly Jacobs, and the email said, I read your law review article, and so I first stopped and I thought, someone read my article, that wasn't my mother, this is really exciting. But then it was a really sobering email, because what she was telling me was, you mentioned something in your article, something called revenge porn, and that was what we, sort of the term that was used back then. And this is the experience that someone has if they have intimate images themselves, either nude or engaging in sexual activity, that they have maybe shared with someone or maybe shared with no one, but someone has decided to distribute it against their will. She said, this happened to me. This has happened to me and it's ruined my life, and I would like to talk with you. I am also in Miami, can we meet? And we met, and I will never forget that the way that Holly walked into my office with this giant 3-ring binder, and in that binder, she had every incident of where these pictures had been sent to her family members, her current partner, to her students. She was a graduate student at the time, and she was teaching classes, to her employer, all the places where she had been stalked, where people were sending her threatening messages, sexually harassing messages, saying, I'm going to find you, people impersonating her online, page after page after page. And what it really just demonstrated for me was all the things that I had written about in a theoretical way, that when someone is the target of this kind of abuse, it affects every aspect of their lives, their intimate relationships, their families, their educational opportunities, their professional opportunities, everything. And what it does for so many people in that situation, and what she was describing, was the sense of being silenced, that you shut everything down, shut down your social media accounts, withdraw from your classes, stop engaging in public speaking, disappear, because everyone's looking at you without consent, you just want to disappear. But at the moment that she was in my office, she said, that was where I was. Where I am now is I'm angry. I'm angry and I don't want to be silent and I don't want to disappear. I have a vision. I have a vision that we could create an organization that is going to call for changes. And it's going to call for changes everywhere we need them, whether that's social media having to change, whether that's society having to change, or whether, and this is where I come in, at least according to Holly, whether the law has to change. Because she said, everyone that I talk to about this, lawyers, law enforcement, whoever I've spoken to says, what happened to you wasn't a crime. It's not against the law what this person did to you. And she looked at me and she said, if it's not against the law, then the law should change, and I need you to help me change it. That is basically how we began the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. One of the first people I thought to call after she presented me with this project and this idea and this vision was my colleague and friend, Danielle Keats-Citra, and many of you in this room know who she is, a professor at UVA Law. And she had written a piece in 2011, or published in 2009, that was called Cyber Civil Rights. And we all connected, we had conversations, and we realized that's what we want to call this organization, and that's the approach that we want to take in our battle against image-based sexual abuse. And we're going to tackle it from legislation, we're going to talk about it from the social media aspect, and we're going to have a vast category of social support, which is both going to include individual victim support, but also try to raise public awareness and to offer trainings and insights. So that's where we started in 2013 when everything started coming together. At that time, there were only 3 states in the United States that had laws against non-consensual pornography. 3. Today, there are 48, and that is also, thank you, there are 48. And Washington, D.C., which is great, and also Guam and Puerto Rico. So we're getting there, right, with these laws. And that's been after more than 10 years of trying to advocate for our model legislation and to encourage it as a template. So that's been exciting. Back in 2012 and 13, when we were knocking on the virtual doors of Twitter and Facebook and other places and saying, please do something about this problem, ban it from your platforms, give victims a way to get that material down, they wouldn't answer our calls, right? So they were not paying any attention and saying, it's all free speech, we can't censor anything. So what has happened in the decades since? Every major social media platform now has policies against what is often called NCII, non-consensual intimate imagery, and some sort of procedures, however good or bad, procedures for taking that material down. So that's huge. And then in the social aspect of things, we have really, I think, seen kind of a sea change when it comes to the way that people respond. So it's not that we've fixed the victim blaming problem or that people always are respectful or understand what this really does to a victim or a survivor, but things have gotten a lot better. There's such an acknowledgement now that this is a real form of abuse that has devastating impact, and that's been huge. Now, all that being said, that's the good stuff. The limitations that we're facing, and I see the limitations and challenges as being more or less 3, really. One is, when I said, and I'm really excited about the fact that we've come to 48 states and various territories, is that the vast majority of those laws are quite ineffective. They're not as strong as they could be. They have various definitions across jurisdictions, makes it really hard for victims to navigate. And so what we have needed, first of all, is for those laws to get better, and we keep trying to encourage states to do better. And we need Congress to act. We need a federal definition that is going to be uniform across the US. We do have, thanks to the VAWA Reauthorization Act in 2022, a civil remedy that offers a good definition, but no criminal prohibition, even though we have introduced a version of it in Congress every year almost since 2016. The current iteration is called the SHIELD Act. Please let your congressmen and women know they should vote on it as soon as possible. When it comes to social media platforms doing better, some of them do better, and then sometimes they change ownership, and then they don't do as well anymore. And so we can't really be dependent on the fact that someone in a position of power at one of these companies might decide at one point to do something good, because it could be reversed immediately afterwards. So what we really need is a robust reform that has to come from the law. It has to come from Congress in the form of reforming Section 230, which I know many of you are aware is a federal law that provides vast immunity to the tech industry, and that really needs to be rolled back if we're going to change the incentives of the social media platforms. And the other challenge I would say is that image-based sexual abuse is constantly evolving. People are finding more and more ways to use technology to hurt other people. So to your point about AI, one of the things we are now facing, which I know sadly many of you in this room know personally, is digitally manipulated non-consensual intimate imagery, so sometimes called deepfake porn, what we call sexually explicit digital forgeries. And these are digitally manipulated images of someone to make it seem as though they're naked or they're engaging in some kind of sex act, even though they haven't. And that is just, as we've seen, has become an epidemic. Everyone from Taylor Swift to high school girls are being affected by this. So we need to do the same thing that we did for non-consensual pornography and continue to try to do, and that is to get good state laws across the United States and get a federal bill in place that really does bring all this together. So we really need to affect that. And the other aspect, I would say, the final aspect of the challenges ahead is the sustainability of the movement against image-based sexual abuse. And when I say sustainability, I mean everything. That is the funding aspect of it, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit, but I also mean we have shifted in the last 10 or 12 years from no one wanting to talk about this to almost everybody wanting to talk about this. And that has been amazing in so many ways. It's also been chaotic because people are coming to the space thinking, oh, this is terrible, I have to do something about this, it needs to happen today. And that energy is wonderful, and it is righteous, and it is passionate. But as unfortunately we have learned over these years, you really can't accomplish everything in one day. I wish we could, we keep trying, but it's really hard, and you have all kinds of limitations that the kind of real work behind the scenes for trying to have lasting change is really boring, and it's tedious, and some days you just want to bang your head against the wall, right, of the compromises you have to make, and the explanations that you have to give over and over and over again. And so I think sometimes people coming into that space without knowing that history are quite understandably frustrated, and they are impatient, and they want things to speed up, and that is completely understandable, especially because so many people in the advocacy space have also been victims and survivors. And so it's fraught for everyone. And for so many of those advocates, burnout is a real problem because this is emotionally traumatizing to have to think about these terrible abuses, especially if you'd experienced them yourself. And those who have chosen to become advocates are also going to be subjected to abuse and harassment because they are engaged in that work. So it is this very fraught space in many ways, and I want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to both honor the past of what has come before and embrace all the new energy and the innovation and the new approaches, to remain collaborative and open, give people the grace to make mistakes and to have disagreements, but to really make sure that the movement is as sustainable as it can be in every sense of the word.
Thank you so much, Marianne. So last question. One of the most tangible outcomes from the task force was the expansion of the Image Abuse Helpline and CCRI Safety Center in October 2023 with support from the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. And I want to briefly pause here and recognize OVC Director Christina Rose, with whom that expansion would not have been possible. CCRI had been operating a helpline for survivors of image-based sexual abuse before the DOJ grant, but can you share how this funding will enable CCRI to scale your services? And can you tell us some of the common experiences that you've seen from survivors who reach out to the helpline?
Yeah, so one of the aspects of Holly's vision that was so important was this idea of a helpline for survivors, 24 hours. And for the decade or so that we've been doing this, before we got this incredible grant, we were We have been almost entirely a volunteer organization. So we have one paid staff member who is our extraordinary executive director, and everybody else is volunteers. Everybody on our board, all of our advisory board. Now Carrie Goldberg is in the audience, she's on our advisory board. These are busy people, and they're giving their time for free to work on this issue, but that's really hard when you just have volunteers and one staff person. What this grant allows us to do is to hire staff, first of all, which is exciting. We've never really been able to do that before. But even when we had that kind of shoestring budget before, we had managed to serve about 20,000 callers in about 6 years before we got this grant. But what this grant means is that we're going to be able to serve that same number in half the amount of time. So it's going to double our capacity. 21,700 or so callers is our goal for the next 3 years as opposed to 6 years. And that's hugely important for us because we're just seeing the demand for our services just increase and increase. So to your question about the kinds of experiences that survivors are discussing with us when they contact us, as you might imagine, it's severe emotional distress is across the board. We also see a lot of social isolation, people who have been rejected or criticized by their family members or their current partners, by their employers. We have seen people get kicked out of school because they've been victimized in this way. We've seen people lose their jobs over this. People have to pick up and move because the harassment gets so bad. The financial impact of trying to hire security in some cases. The never-ending effort to try to get images taken down from the internet, when the internet never lets you, never actually forgets anything, right? You take it down from one site, it pops up on 500 other sites. And that space that is created for sometimes well-intentioned and sometimes not well-intentioned reputation services to assist people in getting their material taken down, that is first of all, can be very costly and sometimes is really doing more harm than good if the people behind those services are not legitimate or they're not particularly good at what they do. And then all the challenges of trying to find lawyers. First of all, financial. Do you have enough money to get a lawyer? Will you find a lawyer who can do this kind of work and is really good at this kind of work when it's so cutting edge and evolving? And if you're facing a question of trying to go to law enforcement, how are you going to be treated? Sometimes law enforcement's amazing, understanding, very empathetic, and sometimes it is the worst thing that can happen to a survivor is to be blamed by the police that she's going to for help, and that's happened in many situations. So we're seeing all of those kinds of effects happen, and what we're so excited about with this grant, this 3-year landmark grant, is that we're going to be able to expand our existing helpline services in this way, and we're also going to be able to extend our programming right now that we're doing to raise consciousness and awareness about the various forms of image-based sexual abuse and the way that they evolve, include things like our online safety center and other resources that people can use, and also be able to translate our materials into languages other than English, because we want to be able to serve communities whose first language might not be English. So the grant is going to allow us to do all those things, and I'm tremendously excited about all of that.
Well, thank you so much, Marianne, for your time, vision, and advocacy, and incredibly grateful for the work behind the Image-Based Abuse Helpline, and for all of the work that everyone has put in to make this blueprint and the items contained within it a reality. With that, I'm going to...
Can I just say one thing before? I know,
sure.
Because this, and I'm so sorry that I'm taking, I have the mic, and so I'm going to use it. But I just wanted to say one last thing about the impact that I think those of us who've been working in this space for so long, what we feel when we see this blueprint and this work that you have done. And it has seemed for many of us in this field who've been trying to say gender-based violence is a matter of privacy, it's a matter of freedom of expression, it is a matter of democracy, and we have felt like we've been shouting in the void. That, when we're trying to raise this issue of the history of dismissal of the harms done to women and girls and trying to say the law has never paid enough attention to these kinds of harms. And when people try to do something to try to affect these harms and these issues, we're told, oh, you're being a censor, you're trying to take away free speech. And having to listen to that response of, well, revenge porn is free speech and deepfakes are free speech, and trying to say, no, you don't understand that online abuse silences women. It silences women and girls. It violates their privacy. No one is free if women and girls are not free. What I mean to say is that having the administration take this kind of approach, this all-of-government approach, and have so many agencies here involved in this process, reinforcing those insights, staking a claim to say women and girls' privacy and freedom of expression matters just as much as anybody else's. It is so meaningful, so significant. So thank you to everyone who's been part of that, and specifically to you, Kaylin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franks. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor to Jennifer Klein.
Thank you.
For that last comment. And Kaylin is very modest, but she has also been leading this work globally. And it's incredibly important for the reasons that you just said, which is this is not that this would not be enough, but this is not only an issue